Welcome to the final session of the NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club for Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, written by Dr. Marianne Wolf. We're very excited to be here, and we hope you are too. Reader Come Home is a book that is structured in the form of letters to a reader, as Marianne Wolf looks at what happens to the human brain when we read, and also how we might nurture readers in the digital age. Our speaker today will talk about how to look at developing reading for children between 5 to 10 years and also beyond that. What can we do to help ensure, as Dr. Marianne Wolf states in the book, that all our children reach their potential as contributing members of our society? How do we then grow readers who know how to read physically and digitally and can work seamlessly while building background knowledge, cognition, and empathy? Before we introduce our speaker, we would like to go over some housekeeping rules with the audience. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box right away. Please make sure that you send the questions to panel and attendees so that everybody can see your questions. We'll discuss questions around 30 to 40 minutes into the session. If you raise your virtual hand, we would not be able to attend to your question. Hence, we recommend that you use the Q&A box to share your thoughts and questions with us. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for the day, librarian and early literacy specialist, Sujata Norona. Welcome, Sujata, to the NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club.
Thank you, Karthika.
So good to have you with us.
My pleasure.
Sujata Norona is an educator with a specialization in early literacy. She is a librarian based in Goa, where she runs a non-profit organization called Bookworm Trust, which runs the best serious LEC course in India, and also a wonderfully charming library, which has the best collection of children's books. I have been in one place for sure in India. So on your next trip to Goa, please make the time to go visit the library. You will not regret it. Sujata believes that lives change when we read, and she nurtures children and educators into this thinking. It is wonderful to have Sujata join us today. She has been lovingly perusing Reader Come Home in preparation for this session, and will talk about the processes of deep reading and the bilateral brain, building digital and physical reading prowess in parallel. In today's session, Sujata will discuss letters 7 and 8 of Reader Come Home. Letter 7, the science and poetry in learning and teaching to read. Letter 8, building a bilateral brain. Without further ado, over to you, Sujata.
Thank you again. Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining me on this extremely exciting and almost surreal sharing of a book that I have read and reread and returned to in this time when I'm really talking to my screen and trusting that you are listening and you are with me as I share some thoughts. And these are really my thoughts as a reader from two letters from this quite amazingly dense and delightful book put together for us by Dr. Marianne Wolf. As I put down this first slide and, it says Reader Come Home, which is the title, I also paused to think that for me, this is a kind of coming home when I return to a text and I'm having to think about my own thoughts on this text and also construct them in a way that I can share with you. So I invite you to listen to me for the next 20 minutes and know that I may not be able to do everything that these two letters ask of us. But what I'm going to try and do is share some ideas that struck me as significant as we go through these two letters. As Karthika said, I live in Goa, and in Goa we have this most delightful dessert called bebinka, and it's layered. And the reason I slammed this image here is really, for me, this book is a deeply dense and layered book, but it really is an exciting read. And it conjures in me very similar emotions and feelings and thoughts that a good dessert like the bibinka does. But I point to the structure because I think as readers often, we might read once and we sometimes assume that we've got what the text is telling us. And many good readers actually get a whole lot in the first reading. But there's something about the structure of this writing that Dr. Woolf engages with, where she actually brings together an enormous body of work in every letter. And within each letter, therefore, there are so many paths you can, take on to read further and to understand more. So I urge you at the end of today, if you've already read the letters, please return to them. And if you've not, I hope I motivate you to try out reading letter 7 and letter 8. So the invitations today are really to be with me as I talk to you about these 2 letters called The Science and Poetry in Learning and Teaching to Read and Building a Biliterate Brain. I was intrigued by Dr. Woolf's approach in writing this book in the form of letters. As other speakers have shared, letters bring intimacy. Throughout, the culture of writing, we all know that letters actually connect the writer and the reader. But there's also something wonderfully covert in this approach, is that while it appears to have a connection, every letter also has subtitles that I ask you to pay attention to, that actually help us to build a logic on what Dr. Woolf is trying to share. So, and for me, it starts with the title. So the science and poetry, I have this pause that, this book is about the science. We know she's a neuroscientist. We know that we've been engaging in the previous 6 letters with really some hardcore, hardwired facts about our brain. And this introduction of the word poetry immediately evoked for me all the magic that language brings to us, that for me as a reader, reading brings to me, the kind of imagery, the kind of evocation that thoughts open up in my mind. And then she says this is both about learning and teaching. And I absolutely admire teachers. I think they are the hardest working community we have, who are doing perhaps the hardest job that we are so poorly equipping them to do. And I loved that she's saying this letter is for you and this letter is for us. So I felt it was a real invitation. And for me, the next title, which was Building a Biliterate Brain, is really actually very poetic if you look at it. When I wrote it down, I was struck that it's alliterative. For me, it was a brand new word, biliterate brain, which is coined by Dr. Woolf. And I hope to capture your imagination as we go forward. So broadly, the approach Dr. Woolf takes in her letter 7 is really one of reminding us about ages, developmental ages, and stages in reading. And she takes a position that the more I read this book, the more I understand is really a trifold position. When she talks about reading, she comes first as a neuroscientist and she gives us all the hard evidence of what she knows about the act of reading. She then approaches every idea as an educator and kind of helps us see what we can do with this evidence. And for me, a very powerful position she takes is that of a citizen. Since she is American and the book is located or steeped in American way of life, education system, she talks of a citizenry in the United States of America. But I think as readers, we can, of course, allow that, transmit that idea to wherever we are and think of reading also as an act of all and each of us becoming better citizens. I add the last point really as my addition, and therefore it's in italics. And Dr. Woolf refers to this in every letter in shades of this, where reading and the act and the ages allow us to become full human beings. And I don't want us to forget that, to not look at the act of reading as from a only clinical, hard-wired kind of frame, but to remember that actually the act of reading allows us to become better human beings. In this letter 7, Dr. Wolf really locates her ideas from an American context and posits something that's perhaps something we've not thought about in India, where there is one way of looking at the levels of reading in grade 3 and 4 as an indication of how many people will go to prison in their adult life. So the lens and the thread between how well you read and your success in school life and citizenship actually will indicate whether you will be lawful or unlawful as an adult. I don't think we use this framework here in India, but the numbers that she points out are not very different from the numbers of people who are struggling with reading here in India. So in her book, she talks of a recent national report card, and I'll quote, she says, documents that a full 2/3 of US children in the 4th grade do not read at a proficient level, that is fluently and with adequate comprehension. I wanted to share something that comes out of the only agency in India that does some kind of a reading test, and that's the Asar Center. And from their 2019 report, I extracted this line: for children's ability to read, half of all children in Standard 3 are at least 2 years behind where the curriculum expects them to be. So if I had to rewrite this, I'd just say that half of the children sampled in the 2019 study are reading, I'll put in quote, at Standard 1 level, based on what the curriculum is asking of them. So I wanted to contextualize this understanding about reading levels as an indicator of the future by bringing in the Asar study here. So for me, as I think of letter 7, the two big ideas are how we assess children, when we assess children, and how do we use this understanding that comes from good assessment to help teachers become more effective reading teachers in their schools. And Dr. Wolf really cautions us in this letter that let's leave 0 to 5 out of the equation. She says, I've shared in the previous letters how important that time is for children to be with parents, for parents to interact with them. So it seems to be a kind of a sacred space that she is not at the moment engaging in terms of assessment. But because the American school begins at age 5, she actually talks of beginning to assess children from 5 to 10. And she shares that through research, we have what she calls prediction batteries. We have some kind of prototypes that have emerged, some kind of ways that we can understand reading proficiencies or reading deficiencies or reading trajectories, that if we know these 6 or 7 kinds of children that we might encounter and we pay attention to what the research is saying, we can use that to strengthen our children's reading or to identify problems and help our children on their way to reading. She does 2 small cautionary warnings in my reading, which I placed in a different color. She does quote cross-cultural differences, and for me this is really important when we read studies that come from a different culture and a context, to not forget that we are a very, very diverse country linguistically, culturally, and therefore many findings may not easily transfer, but that doesn't mean we don't engage with them. What I love about reading studies is that they allow us to think what could be possible in our context. So she talks of cross-cultural differences of children in Europe, which have found, a study by Usha Goswami has found that if you delay reading even by a year, children seem to have less problems with reading than if it's begun too early. Unfortunately, we've never had any long range longitudinal study on literacy in India. So I have nothing to bring to the table to say what else I know. So I'm just going to park this here, and if anyone has questions, we can take it later. And so she cautions us about this fear of not pushing children to read. And I feel this is so important. Often when there's the overhanging shadow of assessment, we all become victims of that overhanging shadow. And so she urges teachers, because it is very much an American book, to not push children to read in kindergarten because they are going to be tested in grade 3. I thought that was an important thing to place here. When we think of what Dr. Wolf means by investment in teacher education, she actually calls for something that I wish our educational teaching programs understood, was that teacher knowledge actually has to be strengthened across the years that children are in school. We continue to have in India, for sure, fractured teaching programs, in the sense that you are trained to be an early years teacher, you're then trained to be a primary school teacher, you're then trained to be a high school teacher, and so on and so forth. But she actually talks of this knowledge which should be cross-shared across the years. And I thought that was significant for all of us who engage in the act of teaching. She brings up something that I have seen in my little experience with schools, a war that we're still fighting in literacy teaching in classrooms. And it hit the 80s in America, and it was called the Reading Wars. And really what the Reading Wars was really, two very different approaches on how to teach reading. One was the phonic approach, and the other was the whole language approach. Now, each of these approaches came with a battery of resource material, course books, methodologies, and unfortunately, positions got taken. And some schools followed the phonic method, some schools followed the whole language method. And what we know definitely in the 21st century, and definitely since the 2000s, is that actually what reading requires is both these approaches. And so the community of reading researchers have coined this phrase called the balanced approach to reading. And we use it. We use it quite loosely, unfortunately. And Dr. Wolf also cautions us about that. She says, yes, you may say you're doing the balanced approach, but remember that the phonic approach to teaching requires systematicity. It's really the breaking down of words into their individual constituent sounds, and then each sound, when you link it to the orthographic language, has a particular code that matches it. And how do we teach children across the years to grow in a language like this? We know English is particularly complicated. And so how many of us in teacher training courses or in professional development work have really engaged with this approach with the systematicity it needs? But there's evidence to say that to teach good reading, that's how it should be done. So we need to draw on that as teachers. Throughout these letters, she talks of the deep reading process. So I don't really want to go back into it, but it's this understanding of everything that deep reading demands of our mental faculties. We need to understand, so that the package on what's a reading class, the program, the time we offer our children for reading instruction has to actually have components of all these elements. And she asks of us to draw on the benefits from research evidence. So my own take on this is actually Again, a small caution to remember that we are a multilingual country, we are a multi-literate country, we have multiple scripts in our schoolrooms, we have sadly the absence of research, we have a very strong market-driven model that gives many schools course books that are all prepared and teachers have to just follow them. And we have different curricular boards that might decide and declare different core competencies that teachers work towards. So our investment in this country in teacher education on reading and literacy really is, I feel, very complex, and we have not begun. I hope and urge that the more of us who engage with books like this and with ideas like this can actually come together to demand for more literacy research. Which is where she talks of building a biliterate brain. And I did love this image actually, because you can see that the reader is quite content, but the pet animals are not sure what medium is being used. I think sometimes when I engage with young people, and I'm always carrying a physical book, I actually feel very much like these cats. But I'm learning, and I'm definitely learning from all the young children I engage with, that sometimes or oftentimes we.
Good evening. As we wait for Sujata to come back, we'll just speak about a couple of things. She spoke about the kind of work that's required for assessment in schools and the kind of frameworks. And there's a very interesting line that was also earlier mentioned. Sujata is back. We're good. I'll leave it to her to continue her slides for now, and then we will talk about this later.
Thank you, Kavita. I'm sorry. This is welcome to my world. Where the internet really has a mind of its own. I hope you can see my screen. Can somebody just shout out and say yes?
Absolutely, we can see the screen.
Splendid, thank you. So I'm not going to take too much more of your time. Letter 8 is really, like I was saying, a proposal by Dr. Wolf, where she is almost imagining a way forward where we honor both modes of reading, the literate and the digital, the print and the digital. And she draws on research that all of us actually intuitively know in India, which is bilingual research that shows us that people who speak more than one language are often quick, flexible, thinkers and code switchers. And she says, we've got some information like that from research. Why don't we harness it? And I thought that was such an amazing way to take what is good and what we know for sure into the way forward for our children. She feels quite strongly that if we can build this biliterate brain, we might prevent this bleeding of what she calls, the screen reading processes, the negatives of the screen reading processes that are bleeding into our print reading processes. She hopes that a biliterate brain, two modes of working and thinking, will atrophy that. And her argument is that we should hopefully be able to build a skill to read fast enough so that all our circuitry is engaged for the deep reading process, but yet it's slow enough to allow thoughts to form and for this true value of reading that we talk about to be engaged. For me, as somebody who believes very much in a expanded idea of literacy, which is socio-culturally situated, I was delighted to find her reference writing. For me, reading and writing go together. In fact, I always think writing came before reading, otherwise there was nothing to read. So the early drawings were forms of writing. And she says that research shows us that children who handwrite actually become better learners and thinkers. So this is something we should not forget in our way forward for our children. Sorry, now my screen appears stuck, so I'm going to just figure this out. Therefore, her big ideas for me here are the research evidence that would actually impact the way we think about reading, how we actually harness this into training and professional development, and how we ensure as citizens equal access for all children. And this particular point of equal access was very pertinent for me because there was a study that was done in a Philadelphia library of providing digital access to children. And what this study showed is that if you provide digital access, which is what's happening right now in our country, we are saying, let's give our children smartphones, let's buy tablets, let's invest in laptops. Their children might develop some digital literacy without really becoming literate. They become adept at the tools. They might become very good at switching attention, moving through screens, finding things that excite them, but they are not really activating any deep reading processes. And this study actually found another indicator of the role of the parent. And so children without parental interaction fared worse on tests after digital access than children who had digital access but parent interaction. I thought this was important, particularly for us as who work with multiple children and diverse children. We can't expect parents overnight to become those mediators. So our role gets enhanced. And I really want to end, and I've moved around the letter a little bit, because for me, this is the most precious takeaway from this letter, where Dr. Wolf draws on a phrase of another educator I urge you to follow, called Julie Corey, I think she's, who, no, I think I've got her surname wrong, but it'll come to me, who coined this phrase called digital wisdom. I think we all need to draw and harness digital wisdom, because the argument is that we have to be wise to know what works when our children are online in the digital space and what is not working. And therefore, how can we teach our children skills? She refers to them as counter skills. And some of them are, how do we talk to our children and teach them the importance of reading for meaning, not for speed. On avoiding the well-known skimming, word-spotting, zigzag style of many adult readers. On how as adults we should regularly monitor for comprehension while children are reading. She refers to these as counter-attack skills. The other is she warns us about overdependence on software that might be wired to provide children with meanings, speech to text, different kind of facilities that could lead to a reader not engaging their own circuitry and allowing the software to do it for them. I love search and find because I work with the library, and I think it's such an incredible skill that we're forgetting to teach children. It's very much belongs to the library domain of how do you find information. The fourth and the fifth skill, which is part of the digital wisdom package, I think you're all becoming familiar with, particularly because of this new film that seems to have shaken many middle class homes, called The Social Dilemma. But it's about training our children, also training ourselves, to become more discerning readers when we are online, because we know that there is wiring happening that is drawing our attention in ways that perhaps we're not even aware of. And she cautions us about the moral and ethical nature of information that is required in our growing to be digitally wise human beings in the world. I dearly urge you to return to this section on digital wisdom. And the researcher who coined it, her name is Julie Coiro. I'm sorry I renamed her. I want to close with a poet that Dr. Woolf also uses in her last letter as an opening quote. He's somebody I have quite admired. I read him voraciously, and he's been a strong opponent of technology. In fact, there's a wee little book that I kept here to show you by the man called Wendell Berry. It's Why I'm Not Going to Buy a Computer. It's an essay written in the 80s that argues for why would he invest in technology and why would he not? It's something I urge you to try and find and read. But we'll close with a poem from him, which is called Be Still in Haste. And I invite you to first read it quietly. And I hope each of us recognize that we are in this moment, this split second, where actually we can begin to think differently, to draw on what Dr. Woolf informs us so that we begin to be differently in this world for our children who we want to nourish into empowering readers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. That was absolutely delightful. And, on Julie Coy, I want to just touch also on the kind of work that she has done with older children. Much of Marianne Wolf's work is with younger children, as she herself says, that she says, my work stops at age 10, but we know what we can do also with older children. And so Julie so much of work on reading programs and on children, seventh graders and graders, and the references with reading and how they prefer to read. So that is another exciting part of Julie Coy's work. I think you've left us at a very, very thoughtful point of thinking of whether to or not to use digital technology with Wendell Berry's book and his poem. And and really the thought of slowing down. So I just want to start off with Sujata on so Gardner, Margaret Weigel, they've all spoken about the first 5 years and how it's really physical reading that should happen at that time as an antidote to the temptations of the digital world and being passive, because the digital world causes children to be passive and to skim and skip figuring out their own thoughts is what Gardner says. And yet they say that you introduce the digital devices and technology wisely. And that's what you've spoken about right now. So what does this mean for children? Does that mean 0 to 5 don't touch digital devices at all?
If you ask me, I would say yes. Yes, I would say if you could push it to 7, great. Because I think what that time allows the mind and the sensory development to form is never going to come back in a child's development.
Yes.
So yes.
Yes, so Gardner actually talks about it as children figuring out their own thoughts, that give them the time to figure out their own thoughts. And that's best done in a medium where they are not being passive and they're not skimming and skipping. So let them figure out their own thoughts and then go further. Yes, so that's how I read it as well, that the first 5 years, avoid digital devices completely. It just gives into that passive way of thinking and don't bring it in until the time that children have learned to read physically and learn to deep read, to explore their thoughts, right? And many of these researchers also seem to talk about it as until they have learned to write by hand and explore their thoughts, right? So, and you were talking about that too. You were talking about that too, right? And they really talk about digital wisdom and digital wisdom. I mean, Julie Coiro has obviously spoken about that, but also the kind of work by Marina Burrs at Tufts University. I mean, one of the things that really blows me away, and you said that there's a dearth of studies from India. But when you read about the number of studies from Tufts University and Stanford and Harvard, and I mean, this whole huge range of, even in schools, the kind of research that's going on, we really have a lot to catch up on when we don't have, particularly with our languages, if we don't have that kind of work. But Marina Burrs from Tufts University also talks about digital devices to be used as a medium when they are first introduced as a playground for learning a variety of digital skills.
Yes.
And coding, she calls coding a new form of literacy, learning to create and express with a computer, not just in the physical form, learning to create and express with the computer. And she speaks about that as learning, just like for reading, they say learning to read so you can read to learn. And Marina Burrs talks about this as learning to code so you can code to learn.
Yes.
So is that, what do you think about that? I mean, is that, so basically...
I was struck by a thought when I read it, that coding is a language, right? We talk of machine languages. And perhaps, we felt, the human being felt this way when the alphabetic script emerged.
Right.
It was a code, right? Our scripts are codes.
Right.
And we learned those codes, and now, in the last so many hundreds of years, we're taking them for granted. But it is it really seems to be part of our evolutionary way of life. This is a new language, and I do think the kind of systematicity and the kind of logic, perhaps, that that kind of language enables, maybe just print reading doesn't.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think that marriage is important.
Yes. So it's almost like first teach the child the language of the medium, and then let the child play with the medium, because otherwise what the child is going to do is just interact with softwares and apps on the medium and not really know the language. And that's probably, I can't imagine an equivalent of that for reading or for anything else. I suppose, I don't know, can't think of an equivalent at all for that. So Marianne Wolf also speaks about the counter skills, right? So she says that when you introduce children to the digital medium, you're teaching them counter skills almost. So you have to teach children to be able to use their inference and analogical skills and their deep reading skills, which they are learning from a physical medium, but also teach them counter skills. What do you make of that? What are these counter skills that you teach?
I think what I've understood, Kavita, is the counter skills are what will counter the ill effects of the digital reading.
Right.
So, the inability to attend, or the need to be shifting quickly, what we've spoken so much of, the skimming, the, moving superficially across topics. You want to counter that.
Yes.
And our analogic skills from literature classrooms are really the counter skills. Yeah. Right? When we're asking children, what was the core idea? What's the theme of this writing? What evidence will you pull out from this text? You can't do that if you've moved quickly, right? You have to return to the text.
Right.
You have to go deeper.
So it's almost like when you're reading digitally, then you learn to read fast, but you learn to also slow yourself down. Is what I read as the counter skills.
Yes.
What I was wondering, that what are those counter skills?
Yes.
You didn't elaborate.
But the counter skills, Kavita, I feel will come with scaffolding, in the sense that just like in a classroom, somebody actually, constructs this way of thinking for you through activities. We'll have to do it with the digital medium. And that's where I feel the role of the teacher is so important.
Yes.
Because we can't expect parents to know this pedagogy.
Right. But, when you were speaking about that Sarah Newman's study, you mentioned that and in your presentation, and that's really about that third hurdle of access. and she speaks about how parents also need to be part of that journey, because it doesn't help to just give access to students to on digital devices so long as the adults that are in children's lives don't know how to help children build the kind of skills, or know how to not use the medium for entertainment but to express. It has deleterious effects, right? Because those children who end up getting access without the adults around them really understanding how to use the medium is going to lead to them being slower readers than other slow readers that might not have access to digital devices, but may not have equal access to reading as well. That sounded like a very, very scary thought. It sounded like, unless the adults around you know how to handle the medium, don't create access. Is that what is that?
I think you're absolutely right, but we must also remember the market and the culture that's forming around us. How many parents can withstand that, right?
Yes.
So I don't know how we empower parents, but we need to empower parents.
I think that's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to do on both parents and teachers, the kind of skills that are required for being able to handle this. I was speaking with someone who works in my home the other day, and he was talking about how he's just come back from the village and schools are closed there. And he was saying that, I can't help it. They can't go to school. They can't do anything. And I said, well, it's a good thing you were there, because you would have helped your child learn. He says, no, I can't seem to get my children off the smartphone because, and if I said, well, what if you just took it away and you just said, no, you can't have it. He said, then my child just refuses to eat and just sulks and runs away. So I can't even do that. So it sounds like there's a lot of preparation we as a country need to do, as a culture, as parents, at all kinds of socioeconomic levels, as teachers. There's so much of work to be done, which actually brings me to a good, interesting question from our audience, from Meher. And she is asking, what is the implication, if any, of the new education policy and its emphasis on early care and the development of readers in India? And will it make an impact on children of government schools? She goes on to ask another question on digitalization. But I think that's a good question to think about. That will the education policy, with this emphasis on early reading, what will be the impact of that on readers in India? And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think what we all need to do is actually get on a separate conversation about the national education policy, because it's quite complicated in the way it's written for me, and it's also so peppered with the whole vision of technology in education. And in fact, in letter 8, in her third hurdle, Dr. Wolf actually speaks so clearly about the pitfalls of the way we're imagining technology in education. Yes. So I think policies are really vision documents. I think they are meant to have something that we aspire toward, but I really think it is the curriculum frameworks. It is it is at the state level of developing your own educational agenda that we'll see where these ideas take root, because it has to begin with first training our teachers. Who trains teachers in matters of what evidence is coming out of research on technology? Nobody. I've been to workshops where we show teachers how to use Zoom, and that's called a technology training. Yes. We're training teachers on how to get onto a Google Meet. That's not what our teachers even deserve. We have to be talking about things far deeper and layered. Yes. So Meher, thank you, but I really can't answer very positively at this point. Sorry.
Yes. I think the national education policy lays down the groundwork, or lays down a policy for guiding us to look at least foundational literacy as a focus area. talking about up to grade 3 and the kind of work that we need to do from early childhood. But as Sujata is saying, I think the kind of training that's required for the whole system to gear itself towards not just teaching, but also assessment of reading skills is what is critical. They speak about that if a child does not achieve the reading level by grade 3, a child who starts behind at that level will stay behind through life. And that's really scary. But, teaching the skills and then assessing the skills is really complicated. And, on that point, I'd like to get into your thoughts on some frameworks for assessment of reading. I mean, we use a couple of different frameworks in our schools, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see reading assessments being done in schools that you deal with educators? Do you see, and if you do see some reading assessments being done, what are the kind of skills? We look at multiple skills. We look at oral reading fluency. We look at inferencing, of course, is the highest skill, but also comprehension before that. And we have some interesting results from that. But I'd love to hear from you, Sujata. You visit schools and libraries across the country and in all sorts of socioeconomic strata. So I'd love to hear from you on what sort of reading assessments are understood and used widely.
Yeah. So in our country, sadly, in our in our programs on teaching, reading is embedded in language. So you'll have a subject called language, which could be any of the languages, and you are taught to read within that subject. We don't look at literacy as a standalone component. In fact, that's what is critically needed. Our children in early years need a literacy block. They need a block of time where they are only focusing on learning to read, whatever may be the language. And then you can have a block of time that introduces you to the joy that, things in a particular language, texts in a language evoke. So all testing that I have seen, Kavita, is really testing for information that you would have got if you could read a piece of text in a language. We're not testing for literacy skills. So we're not testing for your phonemic awareness, for your phonic knowledge, for your vocabulary knowledge, for your decoding, for your fluency, for comprehension. We are testing, but not systematically. We're testing from this point of view of right or wrong.
Right.
So I have seen children who can do very well on these comprehension tests, because also the questions are in a way that you can ratify some answer and produce it. That is not comprehension. Yes. So how do we even ask questions, right? Again.
Is a good... yes. Yes.
Yeah, so it doesn't
interesting
exist.
Word you're using. The memorization is what it does.
But yeah, that is the reality of mainstream schools. I mean, schools like yours are particular and specific and make up a very small segment of our entire population. Just today I was trying to figure out how many children in this country are school-going age, and the number is close to 250 million. So when you think of a number like that, I mean, my mind starts hurting. Where to begin?
Yes. There's lots. There's just so much to think about, right? I think so. She speaks about so Marianne Wolf and many other thinkers. They talk about first the teaching of language, and you spoke about the language wars, the reading wars, phonics and whole language and all of that. So we'll get beyond that. And once children have learned how to read, then there are all these studies by Martha Nussbaum and others on cultivating humanity and the education for world citizenship. So what is that about? It's one thing is to teach children to read, but what is this about teaching children after they've learned how to read to develop empathy and perspective taking? While they learn how to gain speed and fluency in reading, they also need to start making all these connections. How do people do that?
Yeah, so I really think when we're urging, everybody to become readers, I feel that is our goal, that we all become better human beings. And this pursuit of becoming a better human being will come when I can understand something from somebody else's perspective, when I'm able to actually step into a context I have never experienced, but also to then have a point of view about that context. All this is possible if I'm engaged in the act of reading deeply and reading widely and voraciously. So I really think the load is again for me directly on libraries and people who work with libraries on what are the texts I select for my students to engage with in a particular term. How wide do I want their worlds to open? What opportunities do I give them to come and talk to me about matters that they read with? How do I engage them in conversations with each other so that they can test, you know, the way they are thinking about something that prepares them for the world where they meet real people who don't belong to their communities or don't subscribe to their ideas. I hold great hope for that happening if all of us line up and do our bits, you know, first teaching our children to read, then making sure they're reading diverse texts, critical texts, risky texts, that there are adults who'll scaffold this for them and nurture them into being better readers, and then they're ready for the world.
And then going further from there to teach them how to code, and then teach them how to apply the same skills of empathy and meaning and analogy and all of that along with the coding. Sounds like a lot of skills that are really required, right? So it's there's lots
You
to
know,
do. Lots to do.
when I had to pick a sentence I liked, I loved letter 7 ends with buckle up, we're, you know, on a wild ride. I think that's so true.
Yes.
This is a wild ride for us, Kavita.
There's a lot to do. So what can people do to, you know, to get started, to make it simple? You know, I'm wondering, there's also this whole role of stories and, you know, where does it start? What can people do to make it easy instead of just taking on the whole complex giant? What can parents do? What can teachers do to in their classrooms? What can parents do from, you know, with their young children, with their older children? You know, I think the teaching of reading just never stops. And that's what many of the studies that have been cited in this wonderful book say, that you just continue teaching reading for as long as you are teaching. So I'm looking at my college age child, 19 years old, and he's being taught how to read at Ashoka. So it clearly never stops. And I think it's, so where do we start? Where do we start? What can make it easy for our parents or for our teachers?
I think believe that this is something you must invest in. Believe it, you know, trust that this is something that you have to invest in, the idea and the practice. And it can start in the smallest of ways of even just telling a story every day or having your child tell you a story every day. But that's also a text, it's an oral text, but you're beginning to share something together. And you know, deepen that. I think it doesn't have to be big, but I think it comes with a belief, you know, to trust that this is the journey and this is the journey that will help all of us become better people in this world. Definitely less polarized, more accepting.
Yeah.
Every quality I can think of will come if we all engage in reading deeply.
Yeah. So I have a question. I have a quick question for the audience, because I think it's very important for parents and educators to know why they want a child to read before they start off on that journey of getting their child to read. So I'm just going to share a quick question, and let's see what we get as results from our audience. There you are, and we'll give you exactly 30 seconds for this. Okay, not everyone. 3, 2, 1. I'm stopping it. Yeah. And let's share the results with the audience. Not everyone responded yet, but why do we want your child or any of the children who are in our care, why do you want them to read? 3% because it's a good habit, 38% because it's a skill that they can use for life, and 58% because it helps them make connections with the world. So it's sort of, where you were talking about, which is making connections with the world and the belief in the power of reading. If we can start there, that seems to be on that third question, isn't it? But if we are only wanting to teach our children because it's a good habit or because it's a skill they can use for life, I'm wondering, does that work? How does that work, and how do you approach all those three sets of aspirations with readers? Is it important for us to approach all of them differently?
I think if you do decide to subscribe to the belief that reading is good for you, the idea, I don't like that word habit very much, because anything that's habituated, actually we stop thinking about it. But reading does, for many of us, it is a habit, right? I'm troubled if I don't have something to read. I get worried about finishing a book because I have this almost, it must be an addiction, this fear of what next. So I think that gets subsumed into it. And this is where the belief in reading actually also takes care of the skill. So
Yes.
I just see it as a bigger goal, you know? Yes. And everything else gets subsumed into that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, there's Kartika, and that's the end of our discussion time, clearly.
Thanks so much. I'm thinking that we have 1 minute left. Do we want to take one last question
Sure, please
from our
go ahead.
audience?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So we have a question from Naina Sunil, who said, what is the best basic way to get a child back after a not too deep digital addiction?
Naina, I love the phrase, not too deep. I think read a book together. It's always worked with all the children I've engaged with. Pick a book that both of you may be interested in and read it together. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That's classic advice, Sujata. And a great note to conclude the discussion. So I'll leave that to you, Kavita.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks. So again, great questions from the audience. We never have enough time to go into it, but it's been wonderful, Sujata. Thank you so much for being with us today. There's so much that we have to learn. I'm hoping to keep reaching out and to share.
Thank you.
So thank you much for joining. We have an exciting announcement to make. Our next event is going to be the Neve Book Awards, which is on October 10. We did not get enough time to speak about Indian stories and the power of Indian stories, something that I've seen in Sujata's wonderful library, that the range of Indian books and stories that exist. So Neve Book Awards is about finding those great Indian stories in the four categories that the award exists. So please join us. The keynote on that day will be Rohini Nilikani, followed by a series of panel discussions with all of the authors for the shortlisted books, 21 books that have been shortlisted. And we look forward to seeing you there. Do join us on October 10. Take care, stay safe, and happy reading.